everything about a family's well-being is centrally affected by where they live and whether they have decent housing.
In my community, they were called the projects. In large cities, in Chicago and St. Louis, and they were the huge, 20, 30-story buildings, and those were the projects.
It went along highways, it went back behind shopping centers.
There were no playgrounds to speak of, and they just went on for a city block.
With graffiti, with junk cars, with rubbish.
People just survived in them, and people who lived in those kind of developments, of course, they were stereotyped.
It was warehousing the poor. It was getting them out of sight, out of mind. It was putting them all in one place so that you didn't have to battle with the issues of neighbors not wanting it nearby.
That on every level we were building large public housing projects which didn't necessarily produce the best environment.
And I think it wasn't oriented to the people really at all.
The year was 1973, and the Experimental Housing Allowance Program was born. Michael Dukakis was governor of Massachusetts. A year later, President Gerald Ford would declare inflation public enemy number one. Public housing, the projects, housed large concentrations of low-income people, and discrimination continued to confront those seeking a decent place to live.
HAP was part of an experiment. The Section 8 program came out of that national experiment, which provided housing subsidies.
Well, I was a long-haired legal services attorney, relatively new to Springfield, doing work in housing and community development. And along came in the mid-70s a bunch of other people that were interested in housing and community development, and they were the core of the Experimental Housing Allowance Program. The voucher program empowering individuals to find the best housing for them as they see it in their family situation truly empowered them and was found to be a very effective tool.
My job was to go out and to meet with the local elected officials and get the municipal officials to agree to participate in the program to allow residents of their community to be subsidized in housing within their community. Very early on, we hired Carol Walker. She came in from the Boston Housing Authority. Later in the process, we hired Amy Anthony. Amy brought brilliance, commitment, imagination, a real determination to make this project successful. Her sense of fairness and justice, compassion for people was what drove her.
Other than being incredibly active and energetic, she was a lot of fun to work with. I think everybody that I knew there loved being there. It was a very warm, satisfying, rewarding place to be, and being on the board and being part of that was a great experience.
We had a vision of where we wanted to get, what we wanted to do, what we wanted to learn about, how we wanted to think about a program, but we were able to make it up as we went along. We were able to invent the best ways to do the different functions of the program, and that was very exciting because we could learn and change and evolve in a way that you don't generally get to do with federally funded programs. The issue of discrimination came in because clearly we were encouraging people to use the private sector to go find apartments that were out there and available, and when landlords would not let them rent, then their choices were diminished. And so it became clear to us that we had to do aggressive enforcement on fair housing in order to make those choices real for people.
I grew up in the very deep South in Lake Charles, Louisiana. I lived there during rigid segregation. There was certainly pervasive housing discrimination in Springfield, in Amherst. There's hardly any question. One of the things that most interests me about HAP was its involvement in the fair housing laws. Ordinary people, minority persons who could afford to pay for an apartment to get them. It was difficult for individuals with large families to find housing, and often it was because of discrimination.
We had a wonderful crew, about 20 people when we began, and we were improvising all the time. That's the flavor of it. And so when we realized, for example, that discrimination was an important theme, we needed people to test, which is a tradition in fair housing, to send someone else out to see if they get rented the apartment, and therefore the owner was turning someone away because of their race, for example. It had a side effect which nobody contemplated, which is when a staff person, a white staff person, goes out to test, they start to understand what it is to be in someone else's shoes in a way that we don't have many opportunities to really learn. If I were looking at organizations to see if they had the kind of spirit and the kind of energy that's important, I would want to know, did they have fun? So we had fun.
In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan began his presidency as the nation suffered through a recession. The prime interest rate would reach a high of 21%, and a period of deep federal cuts in public programs began. By the late 1980s, the country experienced an economic recovery and a boom in the housing industry.
From its inception, and particularly during the 80s, had to show a great deal of nimbleness, of adaptability, responding to new political threats, funding opportunities, and human needs. During the 80s, there were plenty of both.
We had a disinvestment phenomenon that went on at various parts during the 80s when, for whatever reason, downturns in the economy, more properties became troubled.
Housing vouchers, once the experiment had been proven to be a success, other people said, well, let's get rid of the experiment. Let's go to the established tried and true agency, which was housing authorities. What that forced HAP to do was to broaden its basis of support.
For one thing, we grew from about 30 to over 100 employees in the time that I left. So we were able to bring in a huge level of expertise, into the agency, including community people who came and worked for HAP. We also started doing housing development back in the 80s, back at the end of the 80s, and that certainly carried over in a big way to directly create housing opportunities in both big and small communities. The first one that we did was in Holyoke. I'm thinking of the Walnut Row project, where we utilized actually Farmers Home Administration housing because we were working for and with farm laborers.
In the 80s, public support, monetary support for housing was being cut. Housing voucher money started to get split into two different pools. Money for portable housing vouchers, which was part of the original experiment, and money for housing vouchers that would be project-based and would go towards new development or rehabilitation and the like. The HAP response was to adapt to that and said, well, let's do both. What appeared to be a threat turned out to strengthen HAP.
HAP became a little bit more versatile, a little bit more flexible, and searched for new ways to meet the needs of its constituents, the populations that it was aiming at, and particularly finding new partners to join with.